Detroit, 2005. The city's streets hummed with a mixture of grit and resilience, where every cracked sidewalk told stories of struggle. In a quiet, working-class neighborhood, Marcus Davis was known as the man who could fix anything. His garage, small but always busy, kept families' cars running and neighbors indebted to his kindness. To most, he was a pillar, hard-working, steady, dependable. But inside his own home, the truth was more complicated. Marcus's wife, Evelyn, once smiled proudly at his oil-stained hands, proof of his devotion. Yet, over the years, those same hands became reminders of what she lacked: attention, affection, and the sense of freedom she had long craved. Their love, once passionate, had faded into routine arguments and long silences at the dinner table. Evelyn's younger brother, Daniel, had moved in after losing his job. At first, Marcus welcomed him. An extra pair of hands, a temporary guest. But Marcus noticed how often Daniel lingered near Evelyn, how their whispered conversations would stop when he entered the room. Resentment brewed quietly, like a storm gathering far beyond the horizon. One chilly evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his arms crossed. Evelyn busied herself with dishes, her movements sharp, as though each clink of porcelain carried unspoken words. "You're never home," she muttered. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "Someone's got to keep this place running, Ev. The bills don't pay themselves." Her eyes flashed, though she didn't turn to face him. "Maybe if you listened once in a while instead of hiding at that damn garage, you'd know this house needs more than money." The silence afterward was suffocating. Daniel, sitting quietly in the corner, looked up from his beer. His gaze lingered on Evelyn, protective, loyal, and dangerously sympathetic. He saw the cracks Marcus refused to notice. From the outside, there's Wadir. As a typical marriage, marked by financial strain and weariness. But Daniel knew Evelyn's secrets. He knew the bitterness she carried, the years of resentment she swallowed. And slowly, their bond deepened into something Marcus could never have imagined. Late at night, when Marcus was asleep, Evelyn would confide in Daniel. She whispered about feeling trapped, about wanting a way out. Sometimes her words trembled with despair, other times with venom. Daniel listened, his loyalty blurring into obsession. The house itself seemed to absorb their tension. The ticking of the clock grew louder, the walls seemed thinner, and every argument left a residue that clung to the air. What had once been a home was now a battlefield, Marcus oblivious to the war being plotted against him within its walls. On a quiet Sunday morning, Marcus leaned against the doorway, watching Evelyn sip coffee. She didn't look at him. She hadn't looked at him with softness in years. A sudden unease tightened his chest. He couldn't name it, but he felt it. The fragile piece of his household was about to shatter. Across the table, Daniel's eyes flicked between them, his jaw clenched. To him, Marcus wasn't just Evelyn's husband. He was the enemy, the obstacle. And enemies, Daniel believed, eventually had to fall. The storm was still distant, but its thunder could already be felt, rumbling beneath the silence of their home. And soon Evelyn would voice the thought she had carried too long in secret. A thought that would pull Daniel closer and seal Marcus's fate. What if the only way to be free was to make sure Marcus never came back from the water? The unease that shadowed Marcus's household only deepened with time. He worked longer hours at the garage, telling himself he was providing, blind to the whispers that filled the walls he left behind. For Evelyn, his absence was not a relief. It was fuel. The longer he stayed away, the freer she felt to confide in the one person who seemed to truly understand her. Her brother, Daniel. Daniel had always been close to Evelyn. After their parents' deaths, she had raised him more like a son than a sibling. That bond, forged in grief, had curdled into something darker. Loyalty twisted with obsession. He didn't just protect her. He worshipped her. One evening, Evelyn stood by the window, arms folded, watching the rain trickle down the glass. Daniel sat nearby, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. The silence stretched until Evelyn finally whispered, almost as if speaking to herself. "I can't do this anymore, Danny. Every day with him feels like drowning." Daniel's eyes narrowed, smoke curling from his lips. "Then why stay? Why keep pretending?" Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "Because leaving isn't simple. He won't let me go. And if he does, what then? He'll drag me through hell before he ever sets me free." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Maybe freedom isn't something he can give. Maybe it's something you take." The words lingered between them, heavy and dangerous. Evelyn didn't answer, but her silence was louder than any confession. From that night, their conversations shifted. What began as venting turned into speculation, and speculation slipped into planning. At first, Evelyn resisted the thought. She shook her head, swore she didn't mean it. But every argument with Marcus, every slammed door and cold stare chipped away at her hesitation. What if the only way to stop drowning was to pull Marcus under first? The imagery haunted her. Water, suffoca, ting, dark, merciless, became the symbol of her rage. Daniel saw it too, feeding her thoughts with his own venom. "You remember the lake?" he asked one night, his voice a whisper. "The one we used to go to as kids. No one ever goes out there anymore." Evelyn's hands trembled as she lit her own cigarette. "And?" Daniel's gaze held hers, unblinking. "Accidents happen on the water all the time." A chill swept through her. She wanted to deny it, to call it madness, but deep down it sounded like salvation. Days turned into weeks, and the siblings' secret grew heavier. They spoke in coded phrases, exchanged looks Marcus couldn't interpret. Evelyn rehearsed excuses for why they should all go to the lake one evening. Just for fresh air, just for something different. Marcus, weary and eager to keep peace, would never suspect. Yet guilt gnawed at Evelyn in quiet moments. She'd wake at night, sweating, Marcus's breathing steady beside her. Sometimes she'd study his face, wondering how she could both despise and pity him. Other times, she imagined his last gasp of air, and instead of guilt, she felt a terrifying calm. Daniel noticed her trembling once and touched her hand. "You don't have to be afraid," he whispered. "I'll be there. I'll make sure nothing goes wrong." Evelyn closed her eyes, leaning into his words. For the first time in years, she felt in control. The plan was unspoken, but real. The lake waited for them, silent, black, patient. And though Marcus still believed he was the provider, the protector, the man holding his family together, he had unknowingly become prey. The water would decide his fate, but it was Evelyn and Daniel who would guide him into its depths. Soon, the ripples would begin. The plan, though never spoken aloud in full, had taken root between Evelyn and Daniel like a disease that spread quietly until it consumed them both. Every sidelong glance, every half-finished sentence was enough to remind them of the night that was coming. The lake, their chosen stage, waited in silence. It was late summer when Evelyn finally suggested the trip. Marcus, exhausted from another long week at the garage, was surprised when she smiled at him. It was a rare gesture these days, and he clung to it like a drowning man himself. "You've been working too hard," she said softly, brushing his arm. "Let's go out to the lake tomorrow. Just us. And Danny. We could use some air." Marcus hesitated, searching her face. For once, there was no anger, no ice. He exhaled, relieved. "Yeah, Maybe that's a good idea. The next evening, the three of them drove out of the city, past empty lots and stretches of highway, until the trees thickened and the smell of water filled the air. The lake appeared suddenly, dark and still, reflecting the fading sunset like polished glass. To Marcus, it felt almost peaceful. To Evelyn and Daniel, it was the perfect grave. They spread a blanket on the shore, pretending at normalcy. Daniel opened a beer, tossing one to Marcus. Evelyn laughed more that night than she had in months, though the sound carried a sharpness Marcus couldn't place. As darkness settled, the water called to them. "Come on," Evelyn urged, tugging at Marcus's hand. "Let's swim, just like we used to." Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "It's colder than you think." Daniel joined in, stripping off his shirt, his grin too wide. "Don't be soft, man. Live a little." Reluctantly, Marcus followed them into the lake. The water closed around him, cool and heavy. For a moment, he felt lighter, his worries washing away. Evelyn floated nearby, her hair fanning out like dark ribbons. Daniel splashed, laughing too loud. But beneath the surface, tension churned. When Marcus swam further out, Evelyn exchanged a glance with Daniel. The moment had arrived. Marcus turned back toward them, smiling faintly. "Feels good out here." That smile was the last Evelyn would ever see. She lunged, suddenly pushing against his shoulders. Marcus sputtered, confused. "Ev? What the hell?" Daniel was already behind him, strong hands forcing Marcus under. The water erupted in chaos, arms thrashing, muffled screams bubbling to the surface. Marcus fought with everything in him, breaking the surface once, gasping desperately. "Stop!" he choked. "What are you doing?" Evelyn's face was a mask, her eyes hard. "I can't do this anymore." Daniel's grip tightened, shoving Marcus beneath again. The lake swallowed his cries. Bubbles rose, frantic, then slowed. His arms clawed weakly at the water before falling still. Evelyn stood frozen, chest heaving, watching as her husband's life slipped away beneath the surface. For one terrifying second, she almost screamed, almost begged Daniel to stop. But the silence that followed was intoxicating. The water calmed, ripples fading until the lake looked untouched, as though it had never held a struggle at all. Daniel's voice broke the silence, low and ragged. "It's done." Evelyn stared at the spot where Marcus had vanished, her body trembling. Her lips parted, but no words came. They waited until Marcus's body drifted toward the shore, pale and still. Together, they dragged him out, laying him on the sand. Evelyn's hands shook violently as she touched his face one last time. Daniel crouched beside her, his tone steady. "We say it was an accident. He slipped. No one will question it." Evelyn nodded numbly, her mind spinning. She wanted to feel relief, but all she felt was hollow. The man she had once loved, the man she had built her life with, lay lifeless because of her choice. As Daniel covered Marcus's body with a blanket, Evelyn whispered into the night, her voice barely audible. "We can't ever talk about this again." Daniel's eyes locked on hers, fierce and unflinching. "Then we won't. Not to anyone. Not ever." The pact was sealed in silence, carried by the stillness of the lake. But beneath that silence, guilt had already begun to creep in, a shadow that neither of them could escape. And in the weeks to come, that shadow would grow darker, pulling them into a bond far more dangerous than the night Marcus died. The night at the lake ended with more than Marcus's death. It ended with a pact, a binding, wordless agreement sealed not by trust, but by fear. Evelyn and Daniel had buried their conscience with Marcus's body, and now they stood at the edge of something far darker, the rest of their lives carrying the weight of his ghost. The following morning, Evelyn rehearsed the story. She stood at the bathroom mirror, pale and trembling, whispering the words until they sounded real. "We were swimming. Marcus got too far. I tried to help him, but... Her voice cracked, tears slipping down her cheeks. She forced herself to continue. It happened so fast. I couldn't save him. Daniel leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. That's good. Keep it simple. No details, no doubts. If anyone asks, you were terrified. That's all. Evelyn turned to face him, her reflection split between the mirror and his watchful eyes. Do you think they'll believe us? They have to, Daniel said flatly. There's no other option. When Marcus's body was discovered, the authorities treated it like an unfortunate tragedy. The report listed it as an accidental drowning, a common enough occurrence in the lakes around Detroit. Evelyn played her part convincingly, collapsing into sobs when the news was confirmed. Neighbors came with casseroles, hands on her shoulders, murmurs of comfort. No one suspected the truth. But guilt isn't so easily fooled. At night, Evelyn lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment Marcus's hand broke the water for the last time. She told herself it was necessary, that she was free now. Yet freedom felt nothing like she imagined. The house was quieter, but the silence pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't shake. Daniel noticed. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Evelyn broke the silence. I see him, Danny, when I close my eyes. Sometimes even when they're open. Daniel took a long drag of his cigarette, exhaling smoke into the humid air. It's just your mind playing tricks. You need to let it go. Her hands trembled. What if someone finds out? No one will, he said firmly. As long as we stick to the story, it stays buried. But Evelyn wasn't convinced. She jumped at knocks on the door, panicked whenever the phone rang. Daniel grew frustrated with her nervousness, insisting she hold herself together. You wanted this, he reminded her one night, his voice low but sharp. You asked me to help. Now don't fall apart. The words cut deep, but Evelyn didn't protest. In truth, Daniel's loyalty terrified her almost as much as it comforted her. He had become her shield and her prison. The weeks turned into months, and though the world moved on, Evelyn remained trapped in the night at the lake. She stopped wearing bright colors, avoided old friends, and spent hours staring into the distance as if waiting for Marcus to walk back through the door. Daniel, on the other hand, carried himself with a strange calm. He had protected her, delivered her from the marriage she despised. In his mind, that bound them closer than ever before. Yet Evelyn began to feel smothered by his presence, by the way his eyes lingered too long, by the certainty with which he spoke of their future. They had shared a crime, but now they shared something even more dangerous: dependence. One evening, Evelyn caught her own reflection in the window, pale, hollow-eyed, unrecognizable. She touched the glass and whispered, "Who have I become?" Behind her, Daniel's voice broke the silence. Someone who survived. Don't forget that. But surviving and living were not the same. Evelyn's survival came at the cost of her soul, and though the secret remained safe, it had already begun to rot her from the inside. The pact of silence had worked, outwardly at least. But silence has its own voice, and it spoke to Evelyn every night, whispering that Marcus was not gone. He was waiting, watching, and demanding something she could never give. And as the years would pass, those whispers would only grow louder until they consumed her reflection entirely. A decade had passed since that night at the lake, but Detroit had not forgotten Marcus Davis, and neither had his family. Evelyn had remarried, carefully crafting a life that looked normal from the outside. She maintained her composure, smiled at neighbors, and kept her past buried beneath layers of careful storytelling. But inside, the house echoed with silence and memory, and the reflection in the mirror never failed to remind her of what she had done. Daniel, too, had aged. The reckless edge that had once driven him now lingered only in shadows, behind smiles that didn't reach his eyes. He avoided alcohol most nights, but his sleep was haunted by Marcus's face, the water, the panic, and the silent screams that no one else could hear. Their bond remained, tethered by a secret that had grown heavier with each passing year. Meanwhile, Marcus's younger brother, Calvin, had grown from a quiet, observant boy into a determined man. He never forgot the official story. An accident, nothing more. But something gnawed at him, a sense of unease he could never explain. He remembered visiting the family after the drowning, studying Evelyn's eyes, sensing an unspoken tension, a tremor beneath her composed exterior. By 2015, Calvin's curiosity had turned into obsession. He spent hours at the local library, poring over public records, old police reports, and newspaper clippings. The story never fully added up. He found discrepancies in witness accounts, gaps in Evelyn's recollections, and a subtle pattern of avoidance. Something had been deliberately hidden. One evening, he confronted his mother over dinner, watching her fork tremble in her hand. "Mom," he asked carefully, "did Marcus ever seem uneasy with Evelyn before he drowned?" She looked up, startled. "Uneasy? No. He loved her. He always loved her." Calvin pressed on, his tone sharper. "And Daniel? Did he seem too close to her?" Silence filled the room. His mother's eyes flickered, betraying the discomfort she tried to hide. "I don't know what you mean, Calvin. You're imagining things." He didn't respond, only nodded, letting the question linger like smoke. That night, he went home and stared at a photo of Marcus. The smile, the hands once strong, now lost forever. Calvin promised himself he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Evelyn, meanwhile, had grown more reclusive. Even with a new husband, new routines, and a carefully curated life, the past clung to her like a second skin. She avoided mirrors, hesitated when answering calls, and flinched at sudden noises. Daniel noticed her jumpiness but attributed it to normal paranoia. He didn't know it was worse than that. Marcus's memory had never left her, and neither had the fear that someone, somewhere, might uncover what they had done. Calvin's investigation, though tentative, was relentless. Every document, every rumor, every whispered recollection he collected was a thread, slowly weaving a tapestry of suspicion. He was no detective, but the instincts he had developed from years of observing his brother's life made him a dangerous adversary. Evelyn sensed it before she could name it. One night, while glancing out the window, she noticed a figure walking past, pausing as if studying the house. The memory of the lake, of Marcus, surged in her chest like a warning. Daniel saw her pale face and asked, "What is it?" "Someone's watching," she whispered. "Someone knows." The calm they had maintained for 10 years was gone. The past they thought buried was resurfacing, relentless and unyielding. And in the months to come, that resurfacing would lead Calvin to uncover truths that would shatter the careful life Evelyn and Daniel had built. Truths that could not be ignored. Calvin's obsession had grown like a wildfire over the past months. Every detail, every inconsistency, every unexplained absence had led him here, to the Davis family home, the place where Marcus had lived, loved, and died. He moved cautiously, careful not to alert anyone, yet desperate to see the evidence for himself. He had a list of things to find, old letters, bank statements, anything that could confirm his suspicion that Marcus's death was not an accident. The house looked unchanged. Evelyn's curtains were drawn, the porch light flickered weakly, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. Calvin's pulse quickened. Memories of childhood summers spent in this house mingled with the urgency of the truth he was about to uncover. Inside, he rifled through drawers and boxes, careful not to leave a trace. Old photographs stared up at him, some featuring Marcus smiling, unaware of the shadows growing around him. He found letters tucked behind books, notes from Evelyn to Daniel, filled with anger, longing, and plans that hinted at a terrible secret. Calvin's hands shook as he read. He doesn't understand me. I can't stay trapped. I need help. Daniel's name appeared repeatedly. The connection was unmistakable. Calvin's stomach tightened. He flipped through bank records next, discovering frequent, unexplained withdrawals coinciding with Evelyn's errands or Daniel's visits. The pattern was subtle, deliberate, too deliberate to be innocent. Why didn't anyone see it? Calvin whispered to himself. His voice echoed through the empty house. How could they hide something so obvious? He noticed a stack of old diaries tucked under the bed. Hesitation lingered. Some things are better left unread, he thought. But curiosity and the thirst for justice pushed him forward. Opening the pages, he discovered Evelyn's thoughts, raw and unfiltered. Anger at Marcus, fear of being trapped, confessions of planning. Calvin's hands trembled. His brother's death, the quiet rumors, the 10 years of calm, all came together like pieces of a puzzle. Marcus had not drowned accidentally. Evelyn and Daniel had conspired. The thought struck him with violent clarity. Suddenly, a noise upstairs made him freeze. A floorboard creaked. Evelyn? Daniel? His heart pounded as he ducked behind the couch, scanning the room for anything else he could take. He needed proof, something tangible, undeniable. He found it, an envelope labeled Lake, 2005. Inside were photographs showing Evelyn and Daniel near the lake, Marcus smiling in the background, unaware, unsuspecting. Another letter detailed the events leading up to that fateful need. The handwriting was unmistakable. Every word was damning. Calvin felt a rush of anger and grief. Marcus had been innocent. He had trusted, loved, and died at the hands of those he considered family. And now, 10 years later, the truth lay in Calvin's hands, vivid and undeniable. Finally, he whispered, voice hoarse, clenching the letters like a weapon. Finally, someone will pay. Outside, the night was dark and still, but inside, the storm had begun. Calvin's mind raced, devising how to confront Evelyn and Daniel. The temptation to go to the police flickered briefly, but the thought of justice delayed, filtered through bureaucracy, felt insufficient. Marcus deserved more than a slow revelation. He deserved immediate reckoning. He placed the evidence carefully into his bag, each item a shard of truth, a piece of vengeance waiting to be enacted. Calvin knew the moment was near when the careful lives Evelyn and Daniel had built would unravel completely. Evelyn and Daniel had hidden behind silence for 10 years, believing the past could stay buried. But secrets, Calvin realized, have a way of surfacing, relentless, merciless, and unforgiving. And now, armed with proof, he was ready to expose them. The lake had claimed Marcus once, but this time, the reckoning would not be silent. Calvin's jaw tightened. He would not leave until the truth was exacted, and nothing could stop him. The air was thick with tension, almost tangible, as Calvin parked his car a few blocks away from Evelyn's house. Streetlights flickered along the cracked sidewalks, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward him like fingers. In his bag were the letters, photographs, and bank records, proof of betrayal, proof that Marcus had been taken from the world by the people who should have loved him. Tonight, he would demand answers. Inside the house, Evelyn and Daniel sat in the living room, unaware that the past they thought buried was about to storm back into their lives. The television flickered on, a muted background hum to the quiet rhythm of their uneasy peace. Evelyn sipped her tea, glancing toward the door every few minutes, while Daniel's fingers drummed against the armrest, restless and alert. A knock at the door startled them both. Evelyn froze, her heart hammering. Who? Daniel's brow furrowed. I'll get it. He opened the door to reveal Calvin, calm but intense, his eyes dark with determination. The letters poked slightly from his bag, almost as if they were weapons themselves. I need to speak with both of you, Calvin said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. Evelyn's lips parted, pale and shaking. Calvin, what are you doing here? I found everything, he said simply, setting the bag on the table. The letters, the photographs, the truth about Marcus. Daniel's face drained of color. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, trying to assert control. Calvin lifted a photograph, showing Marcus laughing near the lake, oblivious to the danger around him. Do I? He said coldly. You killed him. You left him to die. And now I'm here to make sure justice is served. Evelyn staggered back, clutching a chair for support. Her eyes darted to Daniel. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she whispered, voice trembling. It was an accident. I swear. Calvin shook his head, eyes burning. Accident? You call drowning my brother an accident? His hands slammed onto the table, rattling the photographs. You took his life. You lied for 10 years. And now, you'll answer for it. Daniel stepped forward, his tone sharp. Calvin, calm down. This doesn't have to get out of hand. We can explain. You will explain, Calvin interrupted, voice low, deliberate. But first, I need you to feel the weight of what you've done. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in with judgment. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps, and Daniel's attempts at composure faltered under the intensity of Calvin's stare. For the first time in 10 years, they were vulnerable. No lies, no rehearsed excuses, no staged smiles. Nothing could protect them. Calvin spread the letters and photographs across the table, forcing them into confrontation with the evidence of their betrayal. This is your truth, he said, pointing to the images of Marcus at the lake. This is the story you tried to bury. And now, there's no running from it. Evelyn sank into the couch, shaking, while Daniel's face twisted with a mixture of fear and defiance. Calvin could feel their panic, taste their regret, and it fueled a sense of grim satisfaction. You both thought silence would save you, he said softly, almost whispering. But silence has a way of breaking. And tonight, it's broken. A tense pause hung in the air. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, echoing like the faint whisper of a verdict yet to be passed. Evelyn and Daniel could sense the inevitable. The reckoning they had long avoided was now upon them. Calvin's eyes swept the room, locking onto theirs. The past isn't over, he murmured. Not until justice is done. The night had begun, and with it, the fragile balance of control between the guilty and the avenger collapsed completely. The tension that had gripped the room since Calvin's arrival erupted like a storm breaking through glass. Evelyn's trembling hands hovered over the photographs, her eyes wide with fear. Daniel's chest heaved, his mind scrambling for escape, for control, for a way to survive. But Calvin's presence was relentless, cold, precise, unyielding. You should have thought about the consequences, Calvin said, his voice low and steady. You thought silence could protect you for 10 years, but silence can't bury guilt forever. Evelyn stumbled back, clutching the armrest of the couch, tears streaming down her face. Calvin, please. I didn't mean... Daniel stepped forward, trying to intercede. Enough, Calvin. Listen to me. We can fix this. We can... Calvin's eyes burned into him. No, you can't fix what you destroyed. And then it began. The confrontation turned violent in an instant. Daniel lunged for Calvin, a desperate, uncoordinated attack. But Calvin's timing was precise. He sidestepped, shoving Daniel against the wall with enough force to knock the breath from his lungs. Evelyn Esky reamed, but the sound was swallowed by the heavy, oppressive silence of the room. You left him to die, Calvin shouted, shaking the letters in his hand. You killed my brother, and now it ends. Daniel's face twisted in a mix of rage and fear. He lunged again, but Calvin was ready, moving with a controlled fury that left no room for hesitation. Within moments, Daniel was pinned, unable to breathe, unable to move. Evelyn dropped to her knees, clutching her husband's arm, her cries echoing through the room. Calvin's hands were steady, almost surgical in their precision. The photographs, letters, and bank records, tangible evidence of betrayal, lay on the table, a testament to the truth that had festered for a decade. He looked at Daniel, and in his eyes, the years of grief, anger, and obsession burned like wildfire. "You took everything from him," Calvin said, voice barely above a whisper. "And now, I take back what you stole." Daniel tried to speak, but the words choked in his throat. Evelyn's sobs grew louder, her body shaking violently. She pressed herself to the floor, pleading, begging for mercy, but Calvin's focus was absolute, his purpose singular. The past could no longer be negotiated. It demanded resolution. Calvin's rage was methodical, precise, each movement deliberate, calculated, a reflection of the years he had spent preparing for this moment. The room, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, seemed to shrink around them, concentrating the terror, the anger, the inevitability of what was happening. Evelyn tried to intervene, reaching out to Daniel, but Calvin's presence was overwhelming. "Stay down!" he snapped, his eyes flashing. The siblings froze, paralyzed by fear and guilt, trapped in the same web they had woven 10 years earlier. And then it happened. The violence was swift, brutal, and absolute. Daniel and Evelyn, who had once plotted a death in secrecy, now faced one in the glaring light of vengeance. Calvin's movements were precise, a grim mirror of the justice he had envisioned for years. Screams tore through the room, mingling with the sounds of struggle, until finally a horrific stillness settled over the house. Calvin stepped back, breathing heavily, surveying the aftermath. The evidence of betrayal was no longer on paper, but etched into reality, final, irrevocable, and terrifying. He looked at Evelyn, her body trembling, and Daniel, the same fear reflected in his eyes, and realized that vengeance, once unleashed, cannot be contained. Outside, the wind howled through the streets of Detroit, as if echoing the violence that had just occurred. The past, long buried beneath years of silence, had erupted with a force that none of them could escape. Calvin's hands were stained, his heart still pounding, but the satisfaction of confronting the truth was overshadowed by a grim awareness. The consequences of his actions would ripple far beyond this night. He turned, stepping over the wreckage of a life built on lies and betrayal, and knew the final chapter of this story was approaching. The reckoning had been brutal, but Detroit would decide what came next. The night had ended, but its shadows would linger. The first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the wreckage of the Davis living room. The violence of the night still lingered, an oppressive presence that seemed to cling to the air itself. Calvin stood in the doorway, surveying the aftermath, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The room was silent now, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the aging floorboards. Detroit police arrived minutes later, drawn by a frantic neighbor's call reporting screams. Their eyes widened at the scene before them, a tableau of horror, the remnants of years of secrecy finally exposed. Officers moved cautiously, cataloging the evidence while avoiding the pools of shadow that still clung to the corners of the house. Daniel tried to speak, but the words choked in his throat. Evelyn's sobs grew louder, her body shaking violently. She pressed herself to the floor, pleading, begging for mercy, but Calvin's focus was absolute, his purpose singular. The past could no longer be negotiated. It demanded resolution. Calvin's rage was methodical, precise, each movement deliberate, calculated, a reflection of the years he had spent preparing for this moment. The room, dimly lit by a single overhead bulb, seemed to shrink around them, concentrating the terror, the anger, the inevitability of what was happening. Evelyn tried to intervene, reaching out to Daniel, but Calvin's presence was overwhelming. "Stay down!" he snapped, his eyes flashing. The siblings froze, paralyzed by fear and guilt, trapped in the same web they had woven 10 years earlier. And then it happened. The violence was swift, brutal, and absolute. Daniel and Evelyn, who had once plotted a death in secrecy, now faced one in the glaring light of vengeance. Calvin's movements were precise, a grim mirror of the justice he had envisioned for years. Screams tore through the room, mingling with the sounds of struggle, until finally a horrific stillness settled over the house. Calvin stepped back, breathing heavily, surveying the aftermath. The evidence of betrayal was no longer on paper, but etched into reality, final, irrevocable, and terrifying. He looked at Evelyn, her body trembling, and Daniel, the same fear reflected in his eyes, and realized that vengeance, once unleashed, cannot be contained. Outside, the wind howled through the streets of Detroit, as if echoing the violence that had just occurred. The past, long buried beneath years of silence, had erupted with a force that none of them could escape. Calvin's hands were stained, his heart still pounding, but the satisfaction of confronting the truth was overshadowed by a grim awareness. The consequences of his actions would ripple far beyond this night. He turned, stepping over the wreckage of a life built on lies and betrayal, and knew the final chapter of this story was approaching. The reckoning had been brutal, but Detroit would decide what came next. The night had ended, but its shadows would linger. The first light of dawn filtered through the blinds, casting pale stripes across the wreckage of the Davis living room. The violence of the night still lingered, an oppressive presence that seemed to cling to the air itself. Calvin stood in the doorway, surveying the aftermath, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The room was silent now, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the aging floorboards. Detroit police arrived minutes later, drawn by a frantic neighbor's call reporting screams. Their eyes widened at the scene before them, a tableau of horror, the remnants of years of secrecy finally exposed. Officers moved cautiously, cataloging the evidence while avoiding the pools of shadow that still clung to the corners of the house.